To our webinar on unleaded fuel for aviation. This is one of the largest issues facing general aviation right now. We have a lot to cover this morning, and glad you're here with us. If you have questions throughout our webinar today, you can post them in the chat area there on the right side of your screen, and we'll be looking at those. We'll get to as many of those as we can. We have a lot to cover today. So let me introduce our fellow panelists. We have Mark Baker is the President and CEO of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. We've got Pete Bunce, who is President and CEO of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, and Paul Millner, who is a fuels expert, 35 years working at Chevron on aviation fuels and other things there, also like the rest of us here on the panel, pilot, aircraft owner, and that sort of thing. So a lot of expertise here and lots to talk about. Before we get into it, though, let me do a little bit of a level set of where we are and how we got here. So having led in aviation fuel, it's been there really since the beginning of aviation, and it has a lot of properties that have been helpful to to aviation engines over the years, particularly as an octane booster. And that's primarily what the lead in our fuel is for today, to boost the octane to 100 octane, which is what is needed by the high compression engines in our fleet today. So we have unleaded fuels available now. For 94 UL from Swift, for example, is a fuel that's available and useful for low compressions engines, which really make up about 70% of the fleet. However, that size of the fleet burns only about 30% or so of the fuel. The remaining 30% of the engines burn about 70% of the fuel, and they're the ones that require 100 octane, and so far putting lead additive into our fuel is what kind of allows us to get that 100 octane that those engines require without damaging detonation potentially occurring. So we've been trying to find a solution that takes the lead out of our fuel. It's been going on for more than a decade in one form or another, including through the federal and industry cooperative called the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, where a number of fuels have been tested over the years. None of them have met all the criteria. Meanwhile, a couple of companies have kind of worked outside of that in a different process, getting supplemental type certificates for some unleaded fuels. Swift has done that with 94 UL. They also have a 100 octane fuel that they're working on that they plan to take probably through the STC process. General Aviation Manufacturers Incorporated out of Ada, Oklahoma, they have a very promising 100 octane fuel they're taking through the supplemental type certificate process, and they have some 600 engines already covered. Those are the low compression engines that can use the fuel, and they're working on getting high compression engines approved as well. However, despite the progress that's been made, the Environmental Protection Agency has indicated recently that it plans to have later this year open up a discussion about potentially calling lead a toxic substance that will not be tolerated and will eventually be outlawed. They plan to probably bring that finding out in 2023. So we really, as an industry, really need to pull together and get this solved. We also have issues in Europe, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we welcome our European viewers to the webinar as well. So it's a big challenge. We've made good progress, but we have lots more to do. The FAA last week at a meeting at the GAMA meeting in Washington, D.C., introduced a new concept, sort of an industry and government partnership called EAGLE, which stands for the Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions. And that's really kind of putting a deadline on this whole process that the industry and FAA agree that we will have an unleaded high-octane solution by 2030. So it's the first time we've really had a hard deadline put out there, and in some ways that's designed to kind of really get the industry together and make this happen. So let's start with a discussion about EAGLE and what that means. So let me just throw this out to Pete and Mark, who've been involved in this. What's your take on what EAGLE is all about, and how is it different from PAFI, the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative that's been out there for about a decade? Pete, do you want to start with that?
Well, Tom, if we look at EAGLE and we take a view of participants in it, we launched PAFI as our association effort and an industry effort to try to find a solution. And although we had FAA support, we did not have the continuous FAA joining us at the hip in working on a solution. We also didn't have the airports involved. So now, along with the fuel companies, we have a program that's going to be able to be budgeted for in a much more consistent way as we go through the process to allow us to have the funds through the federal government that are supplemented by industry to be able to go and have a more cohesive and coherent program that hopefully develops the transparency and testing that gets us to the solution that we need. And we're bringing in a wider group of stakeholders in the community as we launch this effort.
So Mark, you've been involved in these discussions too around the creation of Eagle. Give us your perspective on what it means and what the end result might be.
Well, certainly it's a big step forward. You know, PAFI's been around, and we're not saying that it worked or didn't work. We learned a lot, is my view on the old process, but it was time to reinvigorate with the urgency with all the stakeholders around moving forward with whatever process. Once we get a fuel that is acceptable, whatever that is, and whoever crosses that finish line first or even second, or if there's three players, we want to find a pathway to get those fuels into the distribution, into the consumer, and being fully confident that those fuels are ready to go. So I think that's as I view the difference today in Eagle and having been around PAFI for a number of years, this is an urgency change of we got to do it now. As soon as the agreement that in Pete's announcement last week with the whole industry at the table was no later than 2030. And this is an agreement that we believe that the FAA has done a good job of getting broad basis support within the agencies to evolve to this as soon as possible. And I think that by having these meetings with the stakeholders, and Pete and I and a number of others sit around the table, we're actively involved very often now. We're putting a calendar during this with the best people that can be at the table and supportive of whomever gets across the finish line first.
So Pete, does PAFI still exist? Is there still that process for getting fuels through an approval process?
So Tommy, it exists from what we've learned from it. We're taking parts and pieces out of it and melding it into the Eagle initiative because we learned that how difficult a process it is, and there were fuels that didn't make it through as we kind of whittled down to the ones that had the most promise. There were problems with them that were discovered. So that testing methodology is one that's proved fruitful. And by being able to use those elements, but also expanding it out and having these different pillars that we established for PAFI, some that the FAA is responsible for, two are FAAs and two are industries. I think we're able to take PAFI and distribute it amongst a larger group to be able to have more people trying to offer solutions and options as we move down track.
So Paul, let's talk about the lead that's in the fuel today. Give us a little more detail on why is it there and what are the properties that are necessary for us to get the octane that we need without necessarily the lead component.
All right, so there was a huge effort back in the 1920s to figure out how to enhance the octane of gasoline. And a team led by General Motors came up with tetraethyl lead as being the most cost-effective way to solve that problem. It wasn't without problems from the beginning. During that research effort, many people died from lead poisoning, but those problems were fairly rapidly understood and brought under control, and the use of lead has been relatively safe in the industry since then. The difficulty is that the way God gives us gasoline as it comes out of the ground, it's about 70 octane. And as we know, our engines perform much better if we have 80, 90, or 100 octane available. Over the decades, we've come up with many more techniques in refining to rearrange the molecule and get higher octane. But getting all the way to the 100 octane in a cost-effective way that's required for aviation fuel, that had kind of eluded us until very recently.
So without a doubt, I think we all would agree that the lead emissions that come from our aircraft are harmful to the environment. Lead is toxic. You know, we can argue about the small amount of lead that we're actually putting into the environment, but really there's no positive spin we can put on it, the idea that it's somehow good that we're putting lead into the atmosphere. And that's the reason the industry has really come together recently and decided that we really have to get this solved. And of course, the EPA is driving some of that in the fact that they've indicated that they will probably come out with an endangerment finding in 2023, which really changes a lot of things from a pacing standpoint. So, Pete, could maybe you talk about that, what that means and what might result?
Well, we always had a plan that if PAFI was successful in identifying a fuel or fuels, that we then would be able to go to the EPA to trigger the endangerment finding, which starts a process of rulemaking, both on the EPA side and on the FAA side. So, but what is the new dimension now is that time is critical, because the FAA has, I think in their minds, given us enough time to find a solution, which we haven't found the silver bullet yet. And they're saying, okay, your time is going to run out. But if they go and do their endangerment finding in 2023, that really starts a process, a long process of rulemaking. But it will go on with a schedule. Now, why Eagle is so important, and why Mark and I and the rest, all of our industry colleagues are pressing for Eagle, is because with the FAA as our partners in this, they are able to communicate cooperatively with the EPA and say, we have a plan, and there is a stake in the ground of an end date by which we wouldn't go any further. I completely agree with Mark. We'd love to have a solution earlier. The sooner we can get moving to an unleaded solution, the better it is for our entire industry. But with a stake in the ground, we feel that the EPA will be more receptive to listen to the FAA, because they know the FAA and industry are partnering on this.
So there was some disappointment in the community based on forums and a bunch of other communications that we received, including a lot of emails from the announcement last week about Eagle, that there wasn't an acknowledgement by the administrator of the fact that that particularly GAMA has been so successful in getting STCs for its fuel, which again is a little bit different process than was identified for PAFI, a decade or so ago. Pete, can you address that? Why is it that they didn't, that wasn't acknowledged? And it, for a lot of people, it seems like GAMA is really close to having an STC solution that seemingly will work for the entire fleet. Not a complete answer yet on some of the testing on the high-end high compression engines yet. At least that has seemed to meet the industry expectations. But why is it that there wasn't acknowledgement of the progress that's already been made?
Well, I listened to the administrator's words. I don't think he wasn't acknowledging that. I think he recognized, he knows very well, because Mark and I have talked to him many times, that there has been progress. But, just being able to have an STC for the fuel doesn't get you to the end state of who's going to refine it in the quantities that we need, who's going to distribute it, how, we have to have a lot of people distributing the fuel to be able to make it cost effective. So you can't have just one place in the United States do it. It's got to be all around, because and I learn every time that we get into the distribution discussion with all of our great companies that are in that business, you just learn about how cost is incrementally added with the different transportation modes that we use in the different part of the countries that this fuel is, that our current fuels are refined. So there's a lot of other parts and pieces in addition to having an STC. And then a big part of it is transparency. Currently, if you do an STC to a product that is produced by the manufacturers that has a warranty, you, depending on what it is, you'll void the warranty, because that hasn't been fully vetted through the actual company that holds the type certificate for either the airframe or the engine itself. there has to be transparency in testing. Now, whether that's testing that's done by an independent agency or testing that's done by the manufacturer that actually got the TC to start with, to be able to say, yeah, we're comfortable with in this case, with the fuel to be put in our aircraft. You know, yesterday the FAA announced what was called this TAB program, which is to increase transparency all across the board for any manufacturer and have basically a technical panel of experts review all types of things in the manufacturing process. This was all a result of the MAX investigations and everything. And that's really, when you take it down to this level, that's what's going to be required to get what we call a fleet-wide authorization to be able to use whatever fuel or fuels make it to the finish line in this process to be used by everyone.
So, Paul, you've been around this business for a long time. Obviously, very, very close to the chemistry involved in avgas and what it takes to not only manufacture but distribute it. What's your point on, or take on, kind of what you know about some of the fuels that are out there and being developed, and the likelihood that we'll actually get one of them to the end state?
Well, I think that's very promising. I've looked both at GAMI's work and at Swift's work. The nice thing about the STC process is that the STC applicants have published patents, and so if you're able to do a Google search on the name of the company and avgas patents, you can read all about what's in their fuel and how they plan to make it. The PAFI process is not quite as transparent to the general public as that. In fact, you know, even the PAFI participants is supposedly a secret, although it's a very poorly kept secret. And looking at those formulations, they've evolved greatly over the last decade, but the technical issues have been addressed. The materials compatibility is quite clear. It's not going to be an issue with at least those two fuels. And the performance seems to be there. So it's, I think, a very promising time. I certainly take Pete's point that whatever we come up with as the acceptable fuel is going to have to enter into the entire licensing and distribution network. But of course, that's true whether it's a PAFI fuel or an STC fuel. The same challenges remain.
So one of the challenges for us is, in addition to the lead emissions, of course, is the fact that there is really only one manufacturer left in the world that creates the lead additive, the TEL, that gets us to 100 octane. And so that's another real challenge for us. If they were to go away, which from a liability standpoint could happen as a result of the endangerment finding from the EPA, should that happen, that's another reason that we really need to get going. But Paul, what happens if somebody puts an unleaded fuel in a high compression engine? What's the result?
Well, it depends on the unleaded fuel. So if, for instance, commonly available is a number of airports within a 20-minute flight of my home here in California, where I can go buy the Swift 94 unleaded fuel. But I have a turbocharged Cardinal, and if I were to put 94 unleaded in there, I would experience detonation. And detonation causes the cylinder head temperature to go about 2 degrees a second. So in a matter of a few minutes, I'll melt a hole in the piston, which is not very good for engine longevity. So that's a very great concern. You know, in the good old days, we were used to having many fuels. In fact, in the 50s and the 60s, there were 4 grades of avgas that were commonly available. Most of us, or many of us, learned how to fly. There were at least 2 grades, 80, 87, and 100, 130. But many pilots, there's only been avgas in their entire flying career. And so now there's confusion because they pull up and it says, well, it says avgas. What's this 94 number? I thought it was supposed to be 100. And that's a very important criteria for those higher compression engines, because if you run the 94 in an engine that can't get by on that actually needs 100, then you're going to destroy the engine in a matter of minutes.
And so let's talk about Europe, because the one manufacturer of that lead additive is Innospec, which is out of the UK. And with Brexit, them not being a part of the EU anymore in the UK, there have been some changes in the EU where they're about to have a finding of lead as a toxin as well, and talking about potentially as soon as 2024 that you will no longer be able to import 100 low lead into the EU, which, if Britain were still part of that, could mean that the TEL suddenly wouldn't be available. But because UK is not a part of the EU now, it looks like we may continue to have TEL available even going after that. But in talking with some of our colleagues in the UK, or in the EU, such as Michael Erb, who's the Vice President of Europe for IAOPA, the International Council of Aircraft Owner and Pilot Associations, and he also happens to be the President of AOPA Germany, and Kyle Martin, who is the VP of European Affairs for the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Pete's organization. They're on this every day over there too. So let's not forget that it's a big deal. This is a global problem. And that it needs to get solved. And interestingly, in the UK, or in Europe, there are about 54,000 piston engines, of about 18,000 of which require the lead because of their high compression. And that's about the same ratio as we have here in the United States, interestingly. So Pete, what's your sense about what may happen in the EU because of that potential 2024 deadline occurring before we may have a solution available for these high compression engines?
Well, especially in these days, we all know how sensitive, or that's probably a wrong word, but just how much environmental issues play a role in all that's happening in Europe. And we find that on the turbine side of aviation in particular right now. But if the European Chemical Agency goes ahead and their plan is to put tetraethyl lead on their list, then avgas in that 2024-2025 timeframe would not be allowed to be blended. Fuel companies will be able to apply for a special permission to be able to still produce. But the question that always enters in our mind is, will all the fuel suppliers currently want to apply because of the environmental pressure that's on them? And as you said, Tom, very correctly, the UK is out of the auspices of the EU and the EU Chemical Agency right now, but those political dynamics can change very rapidly in Europe as well. So our source of tetraethyl lead and our ability to go and blend it even over there in Europe is in danger, for sure.
Yeah. So we've been getting quite a few questions coming in on the chat. I've got Eric Blinderman here with me, who is our Senior Director of Communications, who's been kind of monitoring that. So Eric, what are a couple of the questions that you've seen coming through?
That's right, Tom, but there's some really good chat, some spirited discussion. And we talked about STCs, and a couple of folks on the line are wondering about STCs versus the platform for broader approval. So for Mark and Pete, if companies like GAMA and Swift have their STCs for a considerable amount of engines, how can those, if at all, be converted to something more generally accepted, meaning something that aircraft owners don't need to pay for?
Let me take a shot at that. And Pete, one of the reasons we created this Eagle platform is to create urgency around solutions. And it's my view, and I think shared by everybody, that once the hypothetical of a STC becomes a reality of certification for a drop-in fuel that does fueling for all of the engines, one solution, we will reorder the magnitude of whatever we have to do, and that's by pulling this group together. There's energy, there's commitment, and there's resources that will be in place once the fuels cross those lines, which way. We're agnostic about it. STCs may be one way, but we're going to still have to find a way to get ultimately FAA to sign off on this thing as a fungible fuel that's been can be dropped in every piston airplane, and that's what we're standing by here for. So right now we have a hypothetical that these fuels will get across the line. I hope they do. I don't care. I mean, we all fly little airplanes that have big engines in them, and we enjoy the heck out of it. And the one thing we need to do is find the first fuel that works, that's STC, and then whatever way we need to move the process to get them approved. There's been examples in the past that Paul's pointed out to me that motor oil for aviation has been done around, the STC process and not have the ASTM, because ASTM is one standard. It's not the only standard. It can be an industry consensus, whatever that means. We'll get better definition across that once we move past the hypothetical of a fuel that will eventually get the STC.
And Pete, do you have any comments on that?
No, totally agree with Mark. I think we all want to get beyond the STC, and the STC is a viable start for many of these fuels. The fleet-wide authorization is one way that the FAA has an ability, because that was allowed for in the last FAA reauthorization, to be able to give that to us. But there, as Mark said, there needs to be an industry consensus body, whether it's ASTM or whether it's a different type of body that would accept it, and that would mean transparency in testing. Why I think we want to get to that point is obviously because we want your engine warranted as soon as you put a fuel in it, and whether it's a new engine or whether it's an overhauled engine, you want it to be covered. And to have that, we would like to have a fuel like we have today that's got an industry consensus standard ASTM process that blesses the fuel, and the FAA can do this fleet-wide authorization. That may not be the only path, but that's the path that the FAA has told us that they have going right now.
Okay, thanks, guys. Eric, another question.
Yeah, just shifting gears a little bit, there's a little bit of chat, not just today, but ongoing, about supply and airports. Question, how do we as the aviation community influence more GA airports to at least have the UL-94 available with the many airplanes that can use it? And related to that, a question we've been hearing is banning leaded fuel just today's excuse for cities to close airports they don't like?
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark?
I'll certainly take a shot at that. And I do think that's in fact what we know is happening at Reed Hillview and San Martin and Santa Clara County. And the FAA has put some real teeth into protecting the distribution of both fuels. By the way, I just want to point out, we are a big fan of 94. It works great. It's a great fuel for those engines that it can support. But the biggest concern we have is safety. Who's making sure that it goes into the right plane, as Paul pointed out earlier, and making sure that both are available, because we could get stranded aircraft and somebody might be tempted to put a few gallons of the wrong stuff in the wrong airplane. And there's a real huge safety concern around that. But 94 is a good solution for the right engines, and they're doing pretty well with it. We just don't want it to be the exclusive fuel until we can get all of the fuel. I know Swift is working really hard on their 100 replacement, and we're just as hopeful for them to get across that finish line with that fuel. But our biggest concern at AOPA is making sure we don't get airports making the wrong decision. We now have the Airports Association as part of this group to make sure that they're informed, can use the information that we're going to be no later than 2030, moving away from this low lead fuel to a no lead replacement. But we have our hands full on a number of localities taking this on as an effort, to aim, in the case of Reed Hillview, get the airport closed, which, they've not taken any IIP grants for a number of years, so they can close it, I guess, in 10 years anyway. But, not use that excuse in the meantime to not support and serve all aircraft that are using that airport. And all across the country, could be a contagion that we're really worried about. So the more information we get out about our commitment to change, on our agreement that this is a safety issue, otherwise we would have already done it, and that we will continue to communicate at our airport support network group that has eyes and ears in a couple thousand airports. And we all, as pilots and as users of this community, have responsibility to go to the meetings, be there, talk about why we are convinced we will have an alternative in the not too distant future.
So
at the FBO level, or whether it's at the local airport level that's owned by the community in the city, to be able to put in another tank. And so they have to also weigh, is the demand such now that they want to put in a separate tank for UL-94, or try to wait to be able just to convert the current tank that they have for 100 low lead to the solution that we come up with. So, there are a lot of communities and a lot of FBOs that are very concerned, because that's not a cheap proposition. We have to take that into account as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Pete. And the one thing we don't need is really a further bifurcation of general aviation. It's already, the amount of fuel we burn is tiny relative to, say, automotive fuel, for example. And the last thing we want to do is bifurcate it even further by having basically a requirement for 2 fuels on an airport, because then our manufacturing efficiencies go down. And as Pete points out, that's a major investment for the FBOs to have to put in additional tanks. Last week after the Eagle announcement, I asked the administrator, what sort of tools does the FAA have, and how willing are they willing to use them with airports to make sure that we do keep 100 low lead available while we're in this transition period? So Mark, Pete, you guys are close to the FAA on this regulatory side all the time. I mean, what's your thinking on the FAA's willingness, or perhaps not willingness, to weigh in with these airports and put a lot of pressure on them to make sure that we've got 100 low lead available?
I'll take the first step of that, Pete. I congratulate Pete and administrator and the rest of our team to work really closely to point this out. And I'm actually impressed, at least from their legal work, that the FAA has put real bite into airports and has put a lot of effort into trying to make it clear that this can't be a decision because of the pre-exemption, if you will, or the ability for the FAA to say, hey, we've got 5,000 public use airports that have been paid for by the taxpayer. They need to be supporting and non-discriminatory to all forms of aviation. And by doing this would be dangerous, safety card, and more importantly, it really would interrupt the ability to use those airports. And I'm so far, I think the FAA has done a pretty decent job of putting real noise out there about protecting these airports at this level. Pete?
Yeah, and I would really compliment the FAA also, because they've kept all of our associations fully in the process of all the communications they sent to, like, Reed-Hillville, on saying, hey, here are a list of questions that you have to answer for us. We have kind of looked at the first round of answering back from Reed-Hillville, and like one of them, we're just sitting there going, yeah, right. The FAA said, is it true that you are banning the sale of leaded fuel, 100 low lead on your installation? And they came back and said, well, we're really not banning it. We're just not allowing it in our tanks. So, that's how they're trying to parse the words. And of course, we all know this is just, as Tom, you pointed out earlier, this is just an effort to try to close the airfield. But it's gained so much momentum already that next week they're having the deputy administrator and a high-level DOT official, along with several members of Congress, will be out at a public meeting there at that airfield to talk about this issue. So we need to stand by, and we need to rely on our communications apparatus to be able to go ahead and add context to what may or may not come out of that. But I think that the FAA is on our team to be able to go ahead and be able to say, now we have an Eagle initiative, we have a way forward, and let's do what we have to do methodically versus just having a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, okay. Eric, another question.
Sure. We've been hearing on the chat and again through other channels that aviators, folks on the chat, would like a little more clarification or further clarification on what exactly are the 2 pathways we're talking about. And then further, when a fuel is approved, what are the next steps to get it to the aircraft where they're needed?
Pete,
Let me take a shot at that, and then I think I'd like to invite Paul and Pete to speak. This is really an important issue, and probably the hardest one to describe completely, because it's not overall until we have a fuel again that actually crosses that line. It's a hypothetical. So if it comes out of the the old PAPI process, there's the pretty obvious way for that to get to the approval from a fleet wide. But again, if GAMI or Swift get STCs for an awful lot of airplanes, and we've seen it being used, we have a responsibility to go as fast as we can with alternative ways to get it approved. That's our responsibility. And I think the FAA stands by to say, show us the fuel. And when that's appropriate, I think we'll figure out how to adopt the process. But again, it goes back to, we need to get across that line. So I want to ask Paul, because he's been around that a little bit before, and complete that message, Paul.
So I think there's a lot of good news here. Pete ought to be patting himself on the back because his membership in GAMA has been helping this process already. Both Textron and Continental have been adding, for instance, the 94 unleaded to their approved fuels list. And so that allows people that are flying Cessnas with Lycoming or Continental engines in it, if 94 is approved for their engine and their airframe, they can go use it now without even having the STC. So that makes life much more easy. You don't need an STC if it's on the type certificate. So the GAMA members have a role in making that happen, and that may not be for everyone. Obviously, there's aircraft that no longer have a manufacturer in place to amend the type certificate, but it is an avenue, and it's already happening. So that's a great thing right there. As far as the STC process, it's interesting that the Eagle pillars, the description of how that process is going to go forward, ends up with something that looks very much like the STC process. It's not an STC, but it has all the same elements and all the same steps. So it seems we're kind of aligned on what that process looks like. What we're hopeful is the FAA's Office of Innovation is excited about really simplifying that process for aircraft owners, so that it's not the traditional, 337 filled out by an IA and sent in paperwork and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully something will come of that. The moving into the distribution realm, we have the existing, 8 places in North America that make avgas. One of the exciting potentials of unleaded avgas is it doesn't carry with it the lead contamination liability. So it's very envisionable that going forward, we could have blenders entering the marketplace to make 100 unleaded because they don't incur lead liability. The existing refineries already have lead liability because they've been blending lead and MoGas since the 1920s. But if new blenders come online, the more people that play, competition is an amazing thing. The margin on MoGas, which you buy at the Texaco station, they burn in your car. MoGas has about a 4 cent a gallon margin. Avgas has about an 80 cent a gallon margin. That's certainly very attractive for new blenders to come in if they're not incurring lead liability. But even absent that, the way the process would go forward, whether a fuel is approved through PAFI or Eagle or approved by an STC holder, is that existing blenders would license that technology and then could start making the unleaded fuel, and then it would flow in their existing distribution system. If we get new blenders involved, then the burden is that they have to come up with a distribution system. The good news is that avgas does not move by pipeline, so there's not big fixed assets that have to be addressed. Avgas moves by barge and by truck, and that's a much more flexible system to allow a new product to be distributed. So I think it's a fairly promising picture.
Right. So, Mark, you and I have been involved in a number of discussions with refiners, existing refiners, about the idea of blending this new fuel, whatever that fuel might look like. And how do I phrase it? I guess there's just been in many cases, some reluctance by the refiners to sort of embrace some of these new fuels that are at least kind of on the horizon out there. Why do you think that is, and have you seen any shift in that lately?
Well, Tom, as you know, it's important to point out the volume in avgas is really tiny. It's 180 million gallons, roughly. And at that small range, again, about 3 or 4 hours of car gas in the course of a year is avgas. So making any changes to a relatively small formula, even though, as Paul pointed out, it's got a pretty good margin, and it's divided among 4 or 5 big refineries and 9 refineries around the country. It's a pretty fragile supply chain already. And making any interruptions to that until we've got a fuel that's been approved, it's a business decision. And, one of the things I've enjoyed over the last 6-8 months is getting to know some of these refining type folks that are making some of these decisions and how they look at this market. And I think I feel good that we've informed them through the Eagle process, and the petroleum groups have joined the Eagle process as an association, is the understanding that we are at this endangerment finding that will be released from the EPA any day now. And that starts a process which will take a year or 2 to figure out exactly what that means and changing the time for a new fuel, but it's coming. And I think that communication to the refiners created that urgency and why they joined the group and why they're interested in finding the solutions. But it is complex, as we've all pointed out. Otherwise, it would already have happened if it was simple.
Right.
No, I think these guys covered it very well.
Okay, and you're right, Mark. The American Petroleum Institute did sign on to the Eagle project within the last week or so, and that is a good indication that the petroleum industry is going to get behind this, and that we can expect some things to start to happen more quickly. So, Eric, any questions?
Actually, it's a really interesting one that came through the chat, speaking of the petroleum industry and fuel. More of a technical question for Paul. Is there any chance that a 100 UL solution could have automotive benefits? Could that potentially allow us to better scale to get to a solution?
Certainly, 100 UL will work fine in your car with a catalytic converter on it. As far as moving it to market, there is the distribution issue again, because we have a system set up to handle airports where you can typically deliver a 10,000 gallon cargo. Service stations aren't necessarily looking for that size of a cargo. But the more restrictive situation is environmentally, because there are limits on the amount of aromatics you can have in MoGas. And it's not a gallon by gallon limit entirely. It's a kind of a fleet limit. So a refiner that said, oh, well, I'm going to allow 100 unleaded avgas to be sold in my service stations, that's going to impact their overall fleet emissions on the aromatics perspective, because the unleadeds we're seeing, at least the STC projects, have a higher aromatic content than MoGas does today. So there is a potential there for that, but it's far from unlimited because of these constraints, these environmental constraints.
Right. Eric, another?
One more for the entire panel. Can you address what the expected cost profile of 100 UL would be?
Yeah, good question. Mark?
I'll take a shot. Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. The original intent of PAFI and others have always been to be, a drop-in fuel that's, competitive with today's price of fuel, which is, by the way, going up. And I don't know what that range of finding means to today's marketplace with, oil at over $100 a barrel. That said, we, Pete and I and the others on our coalition and support group have been constantly asking the questions about, where is this going to be in competitive range? And a lot of it depends on where the fuel comes from, the SDC, the PAFI process, and then ultimately the distribution. Today, as many of you know, one large producer on the West Coast builds a big chunk of the fuel in the Bay Area for the whole Western United States. And if that were to come offline for any reason, the fuel's got to come either from the Gulf or from Billings, Montana, and freight is 40, 50, 60 cents a gallon pretty easily if you have to start going those kind of ranges as we continue to learn about this distribution network. But the only thing I'm going to say is we're going to constantly work on the economic side of this to make sure it is competitive. And how we get there eventually or initially is going to be part of the challenge of why we have Eagle.
Right. Paul, you recently wrote an article for us at AOPA Pilot Magazine addressing the issue of cost, because it is one that people bring up all the time. George Brawley has indicated that he thinks his fuel will come in at maybe 18 to 20% more than conventional 100 low leads. That was a few months ago. I don't know where he still is on that now or not, but I know you have a lot of thoughts on what the actual cost might be.
Yeah, I respect George greatly, but I don't think he's a very good hydrocarbon economist. George can certainly speak to the cost of goods sold, but cost of goods sold is not the price in the marketplace. Those are two independent things. And as we mentioned just a minute ago, the big potential for us is that an unleaded avgas might attract more blenders, and more blenders means competition. And so the industry historically, if you look at 100 years of history in the petroleum industry, they always compete away their margin. So if they have high margin on avgas, unleaded avgas to begin with, they start competing and eroding that margin over time. So the cost of goods sold might be higher, but that doesn't mean the cost at the pump will necessarily be higher. Swift, for their efforts, they say that they intend for their 100R, their somewhat renewable avgas, to be trading at the same price as 100 low lead. So it's not exactly sure how they're doing their economics either, but there's a lot of ways to do petroleum economics, and we can look at cost of goods sold with some certainty. We can see what the pieces that go into the fuel cost, but seeing what's going to happen in the marketplace, that's sort of the miracle of capitalism, the Adam Smith's unseen hand, right? So we have to wait and see how that's going to sort out, but there's certainly potential for it not to be a negative price shock for the aircraft.
Right. Pete, any perspective on that?
Well, Tom, yesterday, Mark and I were on the phone with one of our leading distributors, and he laid out something that he said it may be very similar to what we're seeing with sustainable aviation fuel, where originally the price was relatively high, but as demand started to build and more refiners decided that through their different feedstocks that they could go ahead and produce it, prices as incrementally started to decrease. So he said that that cost may be one that's higher at the beginning and starts to come down as Paul was just explaining, that more people get into the process. It's economics 101 for all of us, the supply and demand curve in that. So I think it's pretty challenging right now to be able to say this is what it's going to cost as soon as we either have a fleet-wide authorization or we have a process where it's readily accepted across the board.
Right. Okay, thanks. So we've talked a lot today about getting everybody together and on the same page, trying to move forward collectively. And you may have heard some of us here at AOPA in particular talking about an avgas coalition, which has been coming together over the last few months. And I understand we just recently, as recently as yesterday, Eric, we hit 100 members in the avgas coalition and planning for lots more. So Mark, you've been involved in this a lot and understand the importance of bringing people together. Talk about the avgas coalition.
Well, it's kind of modeled after what we did with the basic med or the privatization issue. The bigger and broader communication we can have so everybody's on the same page is one of the things we hosted on our website, is kind of the go-to FAQs that this very complicated issue revolves around. And so we wanted all of the thought leaders in there, whether it's a type club, a regional flying group, pilots association, parachuters, it doesn't matter. Anybody that's involved in general aviation and using piston aircraft should be part of this coalition, because the more you know, the better off you're going to be. And I think AOPA has done a nice job hosting this website, gathering as much of the information, having one common place to distribute it. And then as soon as we get news, we have the coalition to get it out to, so that they can become the most informed in their neighborhood or their products.
Right. Pete, any perspective on the idea of pulling together all kinds of entities, not just the usual players in this fuels thing, but as Mark said, we've got flying clubs and type clubs and all that sort of thing coming together.
Well, you saw how powerful this coalition was when we got into that big fight over ATC privatization. So no one in our world should at all think that we cannot have a very strong voice. And so I really applaud all the AOPA team for putting this together, because the more people that we get contributing to this, the more influence that we have, the more call to actions that we have to communicate if we have to go down any type of legislative fronts to be able to help us in this. So I would just echo Mark's remarks and just encourage everybody to be a part of this.
Right. All right. So as we head sort of to start to wrap this thing up, what are your thoughts in general? I'll throw it out there. What haven't we touched on that you all wanted to share, and what have you been hearing from your constituents out there, Mark?
Well, it always comes up in everything. And I was in Seattle last weekend for the Northwest Aviation Conference, and I was at a Florida Aviation group the week before. Why can't we get more MoGas distributed at these airports for those airplanes that can burn, car gas, which is lots of the RO techs and other things. It was said earlier, but we really want one drop-in fuel at the airport because the infrastructure may or may not be available to MoGas to get that stuff there. 94 is a great solution for some airplanes, but our real intent here is to have a fleet-wide acceptable fuel that's drop-in, because of just the scale of economics around most general aviation airports. You can't have 3 tanks and make your choices. And I also believe there's a high risk of safety if we don't have communication about what's appropriate fuel for your airplane. We haven't had to think about that, as Paul said, for a long time. It's just pull up, put the blue stuff in your tank, and away you go. And this is a high risk, and that's why we're asking for the timeline to be a safe transition away from a product that we know the EPA will come out with this finding, and we are on the wrong side of trying to protect that distribution for any length of time. We've got to move on from either the supply chain side or from the general environmental concerns that we agree with. It's time to move on.
Right. Pete, what about you? Anything we haven't touched on?
Well, I think with every type of challenge, Tom, that we get in our industry, we also are able to seize on opportunity. I mean, we're still flying with 1940s and 30s technology. And if we can get the FAA as our partners in this to also look at, why don't we have an easier opportunity to have solid state max? Why are we still struggling and everybody doesn't have an option to be able to have a FADEC? Have we established the certification criteria so burdensome that we can't make these changes that the automotive industry has easily done? And I think that if we can seize on these types of opportunities and also use modern technology, because we can measure, and I think some of our applicants like GAMA have shown that you can measure what's happening within the cylinder with sensors far better than we ever did when we first certified these engines. So using technology to help us find the solution, but also advance engine technology further, I think is something that we all ought to look forward to and look toward what might be a result of this PAFI program that is beneficial to the entire industry.
Yeah, excellent point. How about you, Paul? What did we miss?
Well, I'd like to extend Pete's point and sort of take the low-cost approach. Pete's talking about certifying changes to engines and how that technology might advance. But even without any of that, equipment certification cost and burden, if we have unleaded avgas, we're going to have spark plug deposits are going to go away, cylinder deposits are going to go away. We're going to have a lot less sticking exhaust valves. And it opens up the prospect of going back to an aviation-specific synthetic oil. People, please don't put automotive oils in your airplane engines because it causes pre-ignition and you'll fall out of the sky. Don't do that. But there is a track record. Mobil had a aviation synthetic oil, and those synthetic oils make their engines run cooler, they run cleaner, and you could get extended oil change intervals. So all of that comes with unleaded avgas without even having to do a certification project to modify the engine. So that's the upside. There's a bright side to this future besides the pain that we're having to put up with to get there.
Well, it's good to know we have some upside during this sort of painful transition period that we're going through now. So thanks everybody for your input. I encourage all the viewers to go to AOPA.org/100UL that was up on the screen there a couple of minutes ago to learn more about this issue. It is an important one. It is a complex one. I encourage everybody to get educated on it and to make sure that when you're talking to your friends and commenting that you're using sort of the latest information, that you're dealing with accurate information, and that's what we're trying to put up on that website. There's a lot of FAQs to help you understand this issue. And meanwhile, hope you'll join the Aviation Coalition as well so that we can all be behind this together and get the best solution that meets the needs of the entire fleet and get it quickly so that we can get past that and enjoy the benefits that Paul and Pete and Mark were just talking about. So thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned. We plan to have occasional webinars on this subject because there's a lot more to talk about and it's still unfolding. And thanks for joining us, and we'll check in next time.